Hello, my name's Brian North, and I'm one of the co-authors of the CEFR. And I thought that for the European Day of Languages, I would say something about the more innovative aspects of the CEFR. Well, first of all, the aspect which I imagine you're all very familiar with is the can-do descriptor scales, which are positive with a real-world orientation. And the fundamental idea of these scales, or these descriptors, is that what one should be teaching to students is not the entire language, but what they need to do. The descriptors provide a kind of meta-language which you can use to involve learners and explain to them what the aims are, to negotiate the syllabus, to check progress. They can check their own progress, and to report results. More fundamentally, the descriptors and the system of levels gives a backbone to any language course. I mean, we've probably forgotten what it was like 30 years ago when everything was unconnected. You had an entry test which said something like 57, then you put people in a class which was room 8, and the book they got was called Pre-Intermediate, and the learning aims, if there were any, might be described as elementary, and then there were some progress tests which, things were unconnected, and in the end of it all they took an examination called something like First Certificate. The CEFR gives the basis for a joined-up thinking, for a quality management approach. The fundamental aspects of quality management is really the Deming cycle: plan, do, check, reflect and act. It's really plan, do, check, and then afterwards reflect and act, which turns into planning, teaching and assessment with diagnosis and action afterwards. And the CEFR gives a basis for a course that's transparent in terms of having publicly available aims and criteria for success, and coherent, that all the little bits fit together. You use the same labels to describe the results of the entry test, the class the learner goes into, the books, the progress tests, the exams, what you tell parents, etc. It provides a basis both for educational standards in the sense of the objectives learners are aiming at, and professional quality standards, as, for example, put into practice in the Equal scheme or in the British Council schools. And most fundamentally, the world has changed since we all, to some extent, speak the same language, although we may be teaching different languages. And the extent of networking in Europe has increased dramatically. However, this is the kind of surface, almost superficial aspect of the whole thing. More fundamentally, the view of language in the CEFR is very different to what had gone before. Not to beat about the bush, the CEFR replaces the 4 skills model from 1961, Robert Lado's 4 skills model of listening, reading, speaking, writing, the production and reception in speaking and writing, with 4 modes of communication: reception, interaction, production, and mediation. I mean, people had been saying, applied linguists have been saying for decades, that the 4 skills was a totally unnatural, unrealistic abstraction. People like Breen and Candlin, Brumfitt, Alderson. But the CEFR is the first reference document that actually gets rid of the 4 skills and replaces them with something more realistic, with an emphasis on the co-construction of discourse and interaction, with an emphasis on the idea of language as a collaborative activity. This has had probably the biggest impact of the CEFR. It's very, very difficult to justify a test nowadays that doesn't include an oral. Most orals are now divided up into a production phase and an interaction phase. What people have less noticed, or noticed less, is that the CEFR has a rich infrastructure, if you like, of different descriptor scales for different types of discourse, which each will have their own conventions, their own socio-pragmatic rules. The thinking behind all of these scales is based upon the distinction between transactional language use, when you're just exchanging information, or acting in an instrumental way, interpersonal language use when you're communicating with other people. The emphasis is more on personal expression, on negotiation and developing relationships, and evaluative. There's a train coming, so I shall stop for a second. And then on top of that, there are scales for certain what you might call closed discourse contexts, like interviews and service encounters. Essentially, the CFR offers an ESP, an LSP, languages for specific purposes, approach to general language teaching, needs-based. But it's not instrumentalist in its vision. In fact, the inspiration for the categories in the CFR and for the focus on collaboration comes from an educational research just as much as from linguistic research, particularly the kind of research being done in the 80s in the UK on small group interaction by Douglas Barnes in Barnes and Todd, was published in 1977, but Jill Brown's work in Cambridge, and there were some pioneering certificates called the Oxford Certificates of Educational Achievement. All this sort of thing is much in the literature at the moment, and there was a recent book a couple of years ago by Mercer and Hodgkinson that brings all this together. In addition to replacing the 4 skills, the 4 skills model was not just the 4 skills, it was also the 4 skills and the 3 elements: grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation. And probably the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of language teachers in the world are still using this 1961 model of the 4 skills plus grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation. The CFR, however, sorry about this, it's just where I live and it's hot, so the window's open. The CFR, it replaces or in addition to the linguistic competence, which is covered in the in Laddo's model, the CFR adds sociolinguistic and pragmatic competence. That's to say, pragmatic competence, discourse competence, functional competence, saying what you want to say, doing things with words, speaker meaning in context, Griceum maxims, that sort of thing. Another aspect, the CFR was the first publication to put a positive approach to strategies, to communicative language strategies, following in the vision of Fiersch and Casper. And there are scales for different types of strategies, for receptive strategies, interactive strategies, and productive strategies, and also now for mediation strategies, since we have just done descriptors for mediation. The model or the view of of competence is that competence is a unitary thing. I mean, you do not have components of competence. There are different aspects of one thing, which is your competence. And you can't even make a distinction between your communicative language competence and your general competences. And this is made very clear in the CFR. When you learn things in one context, that the competences that you learn become transversal, so that you can apply them in other contexts. So to summarize all of that, the CFR moves away from the traditional focus in language learning, teaching and testing on linguistic expression to include a focus on the co-construction of meaning in order to accomplish a given task under the prevalent conditions and constraints, mobilizing all of your competencies and strategies in order to be able to do that. Then, finally, there is a couple of things in the CFR which were completely new when it was published. The first is plurilingualism and the second is mediation. They both relate to the view in the CFR of the learner as a social agent who finds himself in a particular or herself in a particular situation in which he or she mobilizes all of his or her competences in order to meet the requirements of whatever it is that he or she has to do in that situation and in that task. Plurilingual competence is introduced as it's something which is not stable. It's always changing. It's differentiated. You're better in one language than in another. It's uneven. Your speaking may be better in one. Your listening may be better in another. And the point is that a plurilingual competence is not a competence of where you learn different languages separately, but there is a kind of fusing or melting between these various things so that you're able to blend the different languages in your repertoire and alternate between them. Now, at the time when the CFR was published, this was considered to be a dangerously outspoken concept, shall we say. There was, as yet, limited research to support it. And it's worth actually saying what is stated in the CFR on plurilingualism. And this is a quote from section 6132. A further characteristic of plurilingual and pluricultural competence is that it does not consist of the simple addition of monolingual competences, but permits combinations and alternations of different kinds. It is possible to code switch during the message to resort to bilingual forms of speech. A single, richer repertoire of this kind thus allows choice concerning strategies for task accomplishment, drawing where appropriate on an interlinguistic variation and language switching. With the changes that have happened in our societies over the last 20 years since the CFR was published, the extent of mobility, the extent of immigration, the profiles of the children who are in schools nowadays, this sort of thing is more and more relevant. There is also more and more research to support the idea of plurilingualism. I mean, we shouldn't forget it's not so long ago that people thought that your brain had finite capacity and that if you tried to learn 2 languages at once, you would do yourself some permanent damage. Nowadays, there's more and more research showing that plurilingualism gives people a more active brain, they're better at making decisions, it delays the onset of dementia or Alzheimer. In fact, there was an article in The Guardian, it's online, on August the 7th, on why bilingualism does wonders for your brain, and it's very definitely worth reading. Then the other concept which was new was mediation. Now, in mediation, basically, as the word suggests, you are in the middle. You're playing piggy in the middle. So you're not concerned with your own linguistic expression. Mediation is concerned with the role of languages in processes like creating the space and the conditions for communication or learning, with collaborating to construct meaning or encouraging others to construct meaning, passing on information, explaining things to people when they can't understand them, elaborating something that's too dense or summarizing something that's too wordy, and adapting your language in the process. It can be social, it can be cultural, it can be pedagogic, it can be linguistic, it can be professional. People do it every day at work, frankly. So it's not something which is limited to education. But whatever form it takes, it involves building a bridge, building bridges across some kind of gap, across some kind of divide, or resolving some kind of tension. And it involves self-effacement. You are not concerned with yourself. You are trying to help other people. And this, again, is a very powerful concept. And we have, in fact, just completed a project to produce new CFR descriptors for the different facets of mediation. And they will be going out to wide consultation in about a month's time. So to summarize all of this, the CFR, what was innovative, new about the CFR is that it gives the possibility of creating a transparent and coherent curriculum, taking into account linguistic diversification, partial competences, plurilingualism, differentiated learning objectives, and lifelong learning. These aspects of the CFR, these innovative aspects of the CFR, tend to be overlooked slightly because, first of all, most people don't read the CFR. It's not actually a particularly mind-bogglingly exciting read. It tends to list things rather than to discuss them properly. However, it does manage to list more or less everything in 200 pages. So if everything was discussed in detail, it would be 1,000 pages. But above all, it's the levels and the grids that present them which tend to dominate things. And as the person who produced them, I sometimes think it's a shame, because the book has a lot more to offer.